And in Zoom right now, can you see my mouse? Because when I go to Google Slides, I have to use their pointer. I'm not a fan of it. So students. Okay, great, thank you. Because I want to use that instead of the Google Slides pointer. But I don't think the recording is going to have the Google Slides pointer, so oh well. I'll experiment with it, especially because things are moving so slow on my end. So what is object-oriented programming? It's a way of thinking. It's a way to organize your code. We as programmers now have this ability to define our own types, our own things about the world in our code, right? And it's also a way to organize data to get your program to achieve its objective. And some of the benefits of this is like readability and for others to understand your code a bit better. You can imagine with the current ways we know how to do programming, it's a bunch of variables, if statements, loops here and there, functions, and once programs get really long, it becomes really hard for someone else to understand your code. Well, here is what computer scientists have come up with to address that concern, that problem. It is a big topic. So in the AP course that a lot of you, I hope, signed up for, it covers 15 to 25% of the multiple choice section. And you're guaranteed to have one FRQ on object-oriented programming or classes. Okay. I am confirmed to be teaching 2 sections of Computer Science A next semester. All of you are qualified to take it because you have programming experience. Mr. Simon will be teaching the other 2 sections, and I hope to see you next year in the fall for those that are still at Lowell. So programmer-defined types. This is objects, okay? So far, we've been using Python's built-in types, and for those in the JavaScript class, Computer Programming A, we've been using JavaScript's built-in types, like var, that wraps up everything, anything from the math library, from variables, integers, floating point numbers, all that. For this first example, we're going to define this new type, and it's going to be one of the most basic. It is a point, okay? And it's just like the ones we studied in math class. You represent it with an x coordinate and a y coordinate, and it just means that it's x away from from 0, 0 going right, and then from the y direction going up and down. Right now, the point, you could probably just use a bunch of variables to represent it, like with the x coordinate and the y coordinate, but you will see the advantages of this object-oriented way of representing a point in the coming lectures. So over here, just some patterns about these slides. Although the main focus is the Python bits of code up here, or sometimes side to side, will be examples in the JavaScript class. So computer programming A, look for the ones that say JS version. In computer programming B, you have the center of my attention. It's in this middle portion. Programmer-defined types. Those are also called classes, and that will be a vocabulary word. You're going to see that again and again. A class definition looks like this. You have the word, keyword, class. You have the name of the class, followed by a colon, and you have some other information. For now, we leave these things blank. Think about this as just a comment that says, this is what my class is going to represent. In JavaScript, it's very similar. You have the squiggly braces, and you'll notice one thing about syntax is that often for objects, because they're new types, they're separate from the built-in types, that you often name them with a capital letter. Same thing in JavaScript. This thing is called a header, and I've walked you through the portions, the codes, and what each part means. Okay. Later, we're going to fill these in with more variables and methods. Computer programming A, that's like the functions, like in the bouncing ball, move, show, and bounce. And over here, the variables, that's like the x, y, center, so on and so forth. We're going to talk a lot about variables today, but you've seen this once before. When we dive into the nitty-gritty details, notice that when you look at this newly defined point in Python, it defines this idea in memory. Okay. Why does that matter? Well, over here, right, this new class that you've made, it's a factory for creating objects, and we use it like this. Blank equals point, and don't forget your parentheses. It's very much like a function. But what you're actually doing here is making a new object, okay? And it's at this memory location. That will matter. Because you can imagine on like a graph, you have a bunch of different points, although they're all going to be different. They all occupy a different space in memory. So that's one part, making new objects. This act of making new objects is another vocabulary word. It's called instantiation, or creating an instance of a class. So here, blank in this short 2-line demo, blank is an instance of the point class. And more generally, every object is an instance of some class. Now, for those that have coded in Java before, everything in Java is object-oriented. Even your main function is an instance of some other class. So attributes or fields. I think attributes, this word is more common. Sometimes you'll see these things referred to as fields. And what are they? They're values assigned to certain objects or certain instances of objects. And we can associate them with an object using dot notation. Like here. Notice this point, and it's nice here that Python and JavaScript have the same syntax. Okay, blank's x-coordinate equals 3.0. Blank's y-coordinate equals 4.0. Now x and y belong to this specific object, blank. Notice that we have not yet tied it to the point class. Okay, named elements of objects, that's like x, that's like y, are called attributes. And a little bit of English, it's attribute, not attribute. I think this is the verb over here. And surprise, you've actually used dot notation before. You've accessed the turtle speed in our very first assignment. You've used math.py in some of the calculations I've given you. In our imaging processing assignment, you've borrowed the width and the height from certain images, and that uses this dot operator right here. It's not just a period. All right, so we've defined them, and then you can read them. So if you type into your Python interactive console window, you type in blank.y, it gives you 4. Oops. If you type in x and then store it, then that value has x. And diving into this line, on the right-hand side, this is saying go to this object named blank, refer to its x value, and then we store it, because that's how this equal sign works, the assignment operator, store it into this new variable called x. Although there's two x's present, notice that there's no conflict, because over here, on the left-hand side, and down here, this is the variable x, versus up here, this is attribute x. Okay, it belongs to this instance of blank, this instance blank of the class point. It sounds complicated, but conceptually, I hope you're following well. It's not so bad. So we've defined them, we've read them. This is how you would use them. So once you've defined your blank x and blank y, like in the previous slides, here's a familiar calculation. We figured out the distance from the origin, right, from these 2 points. The slight differences in JavaScript, right, is exponentiation. You would use the exp function where you have your base and your exponent, and instead of using math.square root in all lowercase, you have a capital M if you were to borrow the square root function from the math library. Okay, this one, it gets a little bit more complicated, and let me walk you through what's going on here. So This one, we're passing an object as an argument. So over here, this value, and in JavaScript, it's over here. The inputs to this newly defined function print point is an object. You can use it like so. And this stuff is new to my Python class. This is sometimes called print formatting or pretty printing. So this %G is like a placeholder. This one too. And then this stuff over here tells you what variables to put in. So there's other kinds of like formats like %S, %D for like decimals, and all this does is like format your decimal or print your words in a certain way. You can also use this as a shortcut to like print out white space instead of using like a loop to have 70 white spaces. You can do like %W70 or something like that. This exact syntax slips my mind, and then you'll have 70 spaces, and then it'll print out whatever you want afterwards. So for this example, when we print a point, we want it in a certain way. We want the parentheses, we want the comma between our x and y values, and that's what this function does. In JavaScript, it's a much more simple. You have the parentheses, you add that with the number, you add a comma, you add its y coordinate, and then you like put it all together. You stick it all together, and then you get this as its output. Almost there. So here it's a practice quiz question for you. Now you have the distance between 2 points, and building on this previous example, maybe you want to code this up yourself. What would that look like? I think I have this last section. So you have points, and now we're going to make a more complicated object. This is a rectangle object. And we have some creative freedom here. We could define rectangles based on 2 opposing corners, or we can define it like so. Let's say the left-hand corner of a rectangle and a width and a height. Okay, the first one should sound very familiar because that's what we're familiar with in processing. It's what you've coded up visually, what rectangles represent. Okay, so let's go with that. And in a nutshell, this summarizes the ideas I've talked about this class over or this session, right? Because class is the name of an object. So over here on the left is JavaScript, or on the right is JavaScript, over here on the left is Python. There are some new ideas here, like over here. Notice that when you define the corner of your rectangle, you actually use an object inside another object. And so the corner is actually one of those point objects we defined earlier. Okay, and this act is called embedding, and now it's beginning to get more complicated. Now we have like variables inside our variables. If you thought functions weren't enough, well then here you go. Right, we have a user-defined typed inside a user-defined typed. And so that layering or that level of embedding goes one level deeper, and this is the last point that's new. Okay, this expression looks a bit funny, box.corner.x equals 0. So in English, that translates to go to the box object, go to the attribute that box owns called corner, then go into corner and go into that attribute called x, and then set it equal to 0. So you can imagine it goes like big down to small. Box contains the corner, which contains the x. And the same idea happens here. Lastly, if objects can be returned, or if objects could be in objects, then you can return them. You can send them back to a certain like function's reply. This one, only the first line differs in JavaScript. Instead of using def, you use the word function. Notice here, this is the new stuff, rect. You're passing in a object into this function find center. It creates a new point, it does some calculation, and it returns that point as your center. And this is an example of how it's used. You're returning an object. It also works, surprise, surprise. Okay, so for tomorrow, I'm going to talk about what it means to be mutable, We also have this idea of copying that you will see definitely for my seniors going on to college studying computer science. This is a very big idea when you're first learning like C or in Java. A shallow copy versus a deep copy, and it has to deal with what happens in memory. So I figured I'd talk about that. If you're looking for something shorter to kind of remind yourself of how to code, then you can have this exercise to work on. I also have the COVID reviews in Google Classroom. You can also click on those. So in Computer Programming B, I have all these reviews that I've posted from 2 weeks ago, a week ago, something like that. And it just refreshes your memory on how to code again, because some of you, maybe you've taken a 2-week break from coding. And all these are optional, they're for your enjoyment. The last couple, it's useful. I've included a notes section in these. And the same goes for my Computer Programming A class. If you want to refresh your memory on how to code again, maybe you want to look through some of these reviews and figure out where you left off. Okay. That's today's lecture.